Hi everyone, Susanne here. I hope you're all well and welcome to Sew Custom. Today's video is going to be the making of this little number. So if you're interested in seeing that, then let's get started.
Starting with the fabric, I'm using this 100% viscose fabric, super lightweight, super flowy and good for a project like this. And on to the cutting out. This is my front bodice. I have a notch at the centre at the neck and a notch which will indicate my gathering later. Notch at the waist at the centre, that will help me when I come to place my skirt. And on to the back, same notches here again. My fabric underneath both bodice pieces is on the fold. And then for the skirt, this is my front. My fabric underneath here is on the fold as well. And I have a notch at the centre at the top and bottom. Same thing on my skirt back. Fabric is on the fold underneath and a notch at the centre at the top and bottom. And then I have two tiered ruffle pieces. This is tier number 1 and I have 2 layers of that fabric for front and back here on the fold for both. Snipping notches at the centre, top and bottom. And then this is the second tier. Again, I have 2 layers of folded fabric underneath this pattern piece. I have 1 notch at the top of this one in the centre. So this is all of my pattern pieces, my bodice, my skirt piece I'll attach to the waist, that first tier which I shall gather down and attach to the bottom of the skirt, and then the second tier which again I shall gather down and attach to the bottom of the first tier. So now for some sewing. So the first thing I'm going to do is stay stitch the armholes. So I'm running a stitch line about 1 millimetre or 2 within my seam allowance. I'm using a tiny little stitch length here, back stitching at the start and the end, and that's just going to stop the armholes from stretching out as I'm pulling this dress together, so you can see that here. So I've done the same thing on the back bodice armholes. And now for the neckline. So I want to gather down the neckline on the front and back. So I have a couple of notches you see me snip earlier, and I'm going to run 2 lines of stitching between those notches and use the threads from those stitch lines to gather down the fabric. So I'm back stitching at the start. I'm using the longest stitch length on my machine and I'm stitching within my seam allowance, stopping at the notch and pulling my threads. So that's how that looks. So now for my second line of stitching, I'm just moving my needle over slightly to the right and running a line of stitches parallel to the first. And again, back stitching at the start and pulling the threads at the end. So that's my front bodice gathering line sewn. So to gather down the fabric, I'm going to leave the threads that are underneath as they are and hold on to the 2 threads that are on the top of the fabric and just move the fabric along the threads. And once it's all done, I'm tying off the top and bottom threads together. That's just going to hold my gathering stitches in place. Give my gathers a little bit of a press. This will help me out later on when I come to finish the neck. And of course I've done the same thing on the back. So now to join my bodice pieces together at the side seams. So I'm just lining up my front and back right sides together and pinning and stitching here at my 1 centimetre seam allowance, back stitching at the start, back stitching at the end. So that's that done. So now I just need to finish off that edge and give it a bit of a press, which you can see I've went ahead and done here. So now I'm ready to finish the armholes. And I've chosen to finish the armholes using a bias finish. This is just shop bought double folded bias. And I'm lining it up with that stay stitching. I'm using the stay stitching as a bit of a guideline here. So I'm lining up the crease of the bias tape just to the inside of the stay stitching. trying to be as accurate as possible here. So trying to stick to my 1 centimetre seam allowance the whole way around. Back stitching at the start, back stitching at the end. So that's how that looks. So I just need to trim off that seam allowance. So I'm taking away about 2/3 here of that seam allowance, ready for pressing. And I'm pressing the bias tape away from the bodice, but I'm making sure that the seam allowance underneath is butted up against the bias tape. And once pressed, I'm ready for understitching. So I'm stitching right along the edge of the bias tape, the edge that's closest to the bodice. That's just going to hold everything nice and flat and nice and neat. I'm using a little bit of a longer stitch length here, back stitching at the start and the end. So that's my understitching done. So now I just need to press the bias in underneath. And now I'm ready to run my second line of stitching, this time on the inner edge of the bias tape. So I'm using that same longer stitch length, back stitching at the start, trying to stick right along that crease edge, the whole way around, and back stitching at the end. So that's my bias all attached and my armhole closed up nicely. And of course I've done the same on the other side. Nice and neat. So now for the neckline. So I'm using bias tape here again. The only difference here is I'm folding the end of the bias tape inside, just to close it off at the edges and keep it nice and neat. So I've went ahead and sewed the bias to the neckline off camera, and here I'm just understitching, all in exactly the same way as I did the armholes. So that's how that looks. But before I can close up the neckline, I just need to make myself some ties. So to do that, I'm just cutting myself 4 strips of bias. I'm folding it in half along its length and running a stitch line just a couple of millimeters inside that crease edge. I'm using a tiny little stitch length here, trying to stick to that couple of millimeters inside the crease edge the whole way along. Back stitching at the start, and I'm back stitching at the end, but I'm giving myself a little bit of thread. I'll use that in a second. So before I can turn my loops in the right way, I've just trimmed off the excess seam allowance. So just like the armholes, I've taken off about 2/3 of that excess seam allowance. And now to turn my ties right side out, I'm using a darning needle and popping that thread you see me leave earlier through the eye of the needle and tying, and then popping the bottom end of the needle through the loop at the top and just threading the whole way through. And once done, this is how it looks. And as I mentioned, I'm going to do that 4 times. So now I'm ready to close up my neckline. So to do that, I'm going to place each of my ties at each edge of my neckline. So I'm just feeding in probably about 1 centimetre just of the edge of the tie into the bias tape and ready to stitch. So stitching just along the edge of the bias, starting where I've placed my tie, back stitching, running right along that edge, pivoting at my corner, and then across the bottom. Trying to make sure that I'm sewing again right along that crease edge of the bias tape. And then at the other side, placing my tie, pivoting at my corner, and sewing right up over the top of the tie and closing off that bias at its edge. So that's how that looks. Super neat and tidy. So of course I've went ahead and done the back as well. So that's my neckline, armholes and ties all complete on the bodice. So at this stage, I'm going to set the bodice aside and work on the skirt. So the first thing I'm going to do is work on that first tier of the skirt. So I need to gather it down before I can attach it to my top piece. So I'm going to do this in exactly the same way as I did on the bodice neckline. So I'm just running my first line of gathering stitches using the longest stitch length on my machine, backstitching at the start and pulling my threads at the end. Then moving my needle a little bit over towards the right and running a second line of stitching parallel to the first. Backstitching at the start and pulling my threads at the end. So that's how that looks. So off camera, I've just gathered that down in the same way as I did the neckline. And here I'm just measuring the bottom of the skirt to the gathered piece and making sure I've gathered enough. Once I'm happy, I've just tied off my thread and pinned and ready to stitch. So backstitching at the start, at my 1 centimetre seam allowance, the whole way across, backstitching at the end. So that's my tier 1 join to my skirt piece. So I just need to tidy up that edge and give it a bit of a press, which I've went ahead and done here off camera. And now for the second tier. So I'm going to do exactly the same thing here again. I'm going to run 2 lines of stitches parallel to one another along the top of that tier. So I'm just finishing off my second line here. I'm going to gather that whole piece down until it matches the bottom of tier 1. So just measuring that up here and ready to pin. And same thing again, stitching at my 1 centimetre seam allowance, backstitching at the start, the whole way across and backstitching at the end. And again, off camera, I'll tidy up that edge and give it a bit of a press, so you can see that here. And of course, I've done exactly the same thing on the back. So I have my top piece of my skirt joined to tier 1 and joined to tier 2. So now I'm ready for my side seams of my skirt. So I've just laid my back over my front right sides together and pinned both sides and stitching here at my 1 centimetre seam allowance, backstitching at the start, backstitching at the end, and of course I do the same with the other side. And I've tidied up this edge as well and given it a bit of a press. And while I was there, I've just ran some overlock stitches along the hem and pressed up the hem by about 1 centimetre. And stitching here directly through those overlock stitches, using a little bit of a longer stitch length, backstitching at the start and the end. And that's my hem all nice and neat, ready for a press. And that's my skirt complete. And with that, I'm ready to join my bodice to my skirt at the waist. So I'm just going to pull my skirt through my bodice and match up the side seams and the waist. So my fabric is now right sides together, pinning and ready to stitch. So stitching here at a 1 inch seam allowance this time, backstitching at the start, trying to stick to that 1 inch the whole way around, backstitching at the end. So that's my skirt and bodice joined at the waist. So off camera, I've just ran the seam edges through the overlocker, and this seam allowance is going to become my casing for my elastic. So in order to make it into a casing, I need to stitch it down. So I've pressed the seam allowance towards the bodice and I'm stitching here directly through those overlock stitches, and I'm stitching nearly the whole way around. I'm leaving myself that little gap, so it's about 2 inches wide, and that will allow me to feed in my elastic, which I'm ready to do now. So I've just popped a safety pin on one end, and I'm going to use that to help me out to feed the elastic through. And once done, this is how it looks. So I'm just overlapping my ends by about 1.5 inches or so, and I'm ready now to close up those ends. So I'm just going to stitch a little box right through that overlap. And finish with a diagonal line through the center. That will just make it super secure. So that's how that looks. So now the last thing I have to do to the waistline is just to close up that little gap. So just running a straight stitch right along that edge, and with that, this little dress is complete. So I have my elastic all in nice and tidy around the waist. I've got that bias finish along the neckline and armholes. Got my ties in. I have my skirt all attached with those 2 gorgeous tiers at the bottom. My hem nicely in place. And from the outside, super neat and tidy. I love how this looks. And then only one other thing I did off camera was make myself a little tie. You guys have seen me do this before. Super quick, super easy to do. And this is what it looks like on. I absolutely love how this has turned out. I love the halter style, those little ties at the shoulder. I love the addition of the tie at the waist. Love the volume in the skirt and the fact that it starts below the hip. It's a bit more of a flattering shape on my body type. This is a perfect little summer dress for me. I love this.
I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you found it useful. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, please do, and I shall see you in my next one. Until then, I hope you have a fantastic week. Bye folks!